Okay, here we go. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Oh.
Did I arrive in Guatemala?
Yes.
Yes, I arrived
in
in
Guatemala.
Where did I arrive?
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala.
Guatemala. Right? I arrived in Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Oh.
Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
AJ.
Well, me,
arrived
AJ.
in Guatemala on the day.
I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No, I didn't
I didn't arrive in Guatemala
3rd.
on November 3rd.
I arrived
in Guatemala
on November
1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
The Day of the Dead. I arrived in
November
Guatemala
1st.
on the Day of
I
the
arrived in Guatemala on November 1st.
November 1st.
Where did I arrive on November 1st?
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala.
Well, Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Oh.
Was I angry about this holiday?
No, I wasn't angry about this
No,
holiday.
I wasn't angry about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday.
I wasn't sad about this holiday.
I was curious about this holiday.
I was curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
AJ
I was
curious
AJ.
about this
I
holiday.
was curious about this holiday. What was I curious about?
This holiday, the Day of the Dead.
The holiday.
I was curious about this
I was
holiday.
curious about the holiday. Which holiday was I curious about?
The Day of the Dead.
Which holiday was I curious about?
The Day of the Dead.
The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. Was I curious about the Day of the Dead, or was I curious about Christmas?
I was curious about the Day of the Dead.
I was curious about the Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Oh.
Where did I go?
The cemetery. I went to the
cemetery. I went to the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery, or did I go to the airport?
I went to the cemetery.
Yeah, I went to the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
Well, AJ went to the cemetery.
AJ. I went to the cemetery. Where did I go?
The cemetery.
I went to the cemetery. Right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery?
November 1st. I went to the
November
cemetery
1st,
on November 1st.
The Day of the Dead. Right? I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Why did I go to the cemetery?
Because I want to see
what was happening. I went to the cemetery
to see,
to see
what was happening.
Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
AJ. AJ went to the
Of
cemetery
me,
to
AJ,
see what
went
was
to
happening.
the cemetery to see what was happening. Where was the cemetery?
Guatemala. The cemetery was in
Guatemala. The cemetery was in Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead?
The holiday. The Day of the Dead is holiday.
A holiday. The Day of the Dead is a holiday. When is the Day of the Dead?
On November 1st. The Day of the
November
Dead
1st.
was on
The
November
Day
1st.
of the Dead was and is November 1st. Okay. So I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead
Nó lại bay cái đường luôn.
to see what was happening. What I found was quite interesting.
Oh.
Was it boring?
No, it wasn't
No,
boring.
it wasn't boring. Was it interesting?
Yeah, it was.
Yes.
It
yes.
was interesting.
It was interesting. The cemetery was
It was
interesting.
interesting.
How did I feel
I felt it was
about
interesting.
the cemetery?
I felt it was interesting.
I felt it was interesting.
The cemetery
Or
is.
I thought
The cemetery was
it was
interesting.
interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting?
It was interesting.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting?
The cemetery, the Day of the Dead, was
The cemetery.
interesting.
The cemetery was interesting. When was the cemetery interesting?
November 1st. The
It
cemetery
was
was
interesting
interesting on
On
November 1st.
the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Okay, the atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Was the atmosphere very sad?
No, the atmosphere was
No,
like
the atmosphere
sad.
was not sad.
The atmosphere
The atmosphere
was like
was
a
like
party.
a party. The atmosphere was very happy. Was the atmosphere sad or happy?
The atmosphere was happy.
The atmosphere was happy. The atmosphere was like a party.
Yeah.
What was like a party?
The atmosphere. The atmosphere was
The
like a party.
The atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party.
Đây là
Where
góc đồng chỗ cái giấy
was
giấy sao
the
ấy?
atmosphere like a party?
In a cemetery. The atmosphere was
In the
like a
cemetery.
party in a
A
cemetery.
cemetery. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. Was the atmosphere like a party at my house?
No, it wasn't like a party
No,
at your
no,
house.
not at my house. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. The atmosphere was not like a party in my house. So the atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere.
Oh.
Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors.
Oh.
Where were the families sitting?
Around the grave. The family was sitting
around
around
the
the grave.
Right? They were sitting around the graves. Who was sitting around the graves?
Families. Families were
The
sitting
families.
around the grave.
The families were sitting around the graves. Were they sitting around the trees?
No, they wasn't
they weren't
sitting
sitting
around
around
the
the
grave
trees. They were sitting around the graves. So, where were they sitting?
Around the grave. They were sitting
Around
the grave.
the graves. Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors?
Yes, they were sitting
Yes,
around the
they
graves
were
of
sitting
their dead
around the
ancestors.
graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their friends?
No, they wasn't. Sitting
no,
around
not
the
really.
graves of their
They were
friends.
sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Who was sitting around the graves?
I told you, families.
Families
Families
were sitting
were
around
sitting
the graves.
around the graves.
Whose graves were they sitting around?
Their dead
Whose
ancestors.
graves
They
were
were
they
sitting
sitting
around
around?
the graves of their dead ancestors. The dead
Yes, their dead
ancestors'
ancestors.
graves.
Their ancestors. Their ancestors' graves. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors or the graves of their friends?
The graves of their dead ancestors.
Right? They were sitting
Their
around the
ancestors'
graves of their dead ancestors. They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers. Who cleaned the graves?
Families.
That's right, the families.
Families cleaned
What
the graves.
did they add?
They add flowers.
They added fresh flowers.
Fresh
Did they
flowers.
add food?
No, they didn't add
No,
food.
they didn't add food.
Add food.
Did they add money?
No, they didn't add
No,
money.
no, they didn't add money. They added fresh
flowers.
flowers. What did they clean?
They cleaned the graves.
They cleaned the graves. Whose graves did they clean?
Their ancestors' graves.
Their ancestors, right? They
Their
cleaned their ancestors' graves. Where did they add flowers?
The graves.
Where?
In the
Oh,
graves.
they added flowers to the
To
graves.
the graves. They add
That's right.
fresh
They
flowers.
cleaned the graves.
They cleaned
and
the
added
graves
fresh
and
flowers.
add fresh flowers to the graves.
Good. I walked through the cemetery and admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers.
Ah,
Where did I walk?
through the cemetery. I walked through the cemetery.
The cemetery. I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the park?
No, I didn't walk
No,
through the park.
I didn't walk through the park. I walked
Through the
the
cemetery.
Where did I walk?
Through the cemetery.
Through the cemetery.
I walked through the cemetery.
Who walked through the cemetery?
AJ walked through the
I
cemetery.
did, AJ. I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the cemetery or did I walk through the park?
I walked through the cemetery.
I walked through the cemetery. That's right.
That's right.
And I admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers.
Oh.
Did I admire the beauty of the trees?
No, I didn't admire the beauty of
I
trees.
didn't admire the beauty of the trees.
I
Did I admire the beauty of the children?
No, I didn't admire the
No,
beauty
I
of
didn't
the
admire
children.
the beauty of the children. What did I admire?
I admired the beauty of all
Flowers,
the colorful
right? Yeah, I
flowers.
admired the beauty
Flowers.
of all the colorful flowers. Who admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers?
AJ. AJ
That's
admired
right,
the
AJ,
beauty
me,
of all the colorful
admired
flowers.
the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Where were the flowers?
In the grave.
On the
grave.
grave. Right. Or in the cemetery.
In the cemetery.
The flowers,
The flowers
were on the grave.
On the grave in the cemetery.
Were the flowers in the park?
No, the flowers
No,
wasn't
they
in
weren't
the park.
in the park. Were the flowers in my house?
No, the flowers
No,
wasn't
they weren't
in my house.
in my house. Where were the flowers?
The flowers
The flowers were
on the grave.
on the graves in the cemetery.
In the cemetery.
Where did I walk?
I walked through the cemetery.
I walked through the cemetery. When did I walk through the cemetery?
On the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Ah, November 1st.
I walked
the
through
Day
the
of the
cemetery
Dead.
on the Day of the Dead,
Right,
November
1st, the Day of the Dead, I walked through the cemetery. What was the cemetery like?
The cemetery was like a party.
Like a party. It was like a party. The cemetery was like a party. Was I curious about this holiday?
Yes, I was curious about this holiday.
Yes, I was curious about this holiday. Which holiday was I curious about?
The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the
Day
Dead.
of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. So I walked through.
Okay, that's all I want to talk. I want to ask your question. Thank you for watching.